Welcome to the Clergy Couple webinar, Knowing Ourselves and Loving the Other. Once again, as always, we thank Leadership 100 for their generous funding for these webinars and for their continued support, which is unwavering on their part. Today we have Dr. George Stavros with us. Dr. George has been with us before. Many of you perhaps have watched his webinar on storms in the vineyard, which has received over 400 viewings. A very, very popular webinar. And George, we're really glad to have you here again. Just as a matter of introduction, George is the director of the Danielson Institute, which is the pastoral institute connected to Boston University. He's also a faculty member at Boston University. He was educated at Holy Cross, has a Master's of Divinity, and in his pastoral work and his work as executive director of the Danielson Institute, he has a real passion for integrating the best and the truths of psychology and the social sciences with Orthodox spirituality. And today he will be discussing with us the relationship between humility and healthy narcissism. George, welcome. It's great to have you back with us again.
Thanks very much, Carrie. It's great to be back with you.
One more quick thing before I apologize, I'm interrupting you already. Please remember that if you want to ask any questions during this webinar, just to scroll down to the bottom of the screen where there's a box, a Q&A box, type in your question, and I will be screening them throughout this webinar. We'll have some time at the end also. Sorry, George.
No problem. All right, well, good afternoon. Good morning to those of you out on the West Coast. Let me tell you a little bit about the structure of the webinar, and then we'll jump right in. So what I plan to do is to start out by sharing some definitions of things like narcissism, pathological narcissism, healthy narcissism, humility, which is closely tied to healthy narcissism, and then talk a little bit about connections between narcissism and religious life, particularly clergy and clergy family life. If we have time, I'll try and share a couple of brief case studies just for us to consider in a short way. I realize we don't have a lot of time, but we also want to leave time both during the presentation and after the formal part of it for some back and forth dialogue and questions. So if we're ready to roll, I'll go ahead and jump in.
Please do.
Okay, so let me start by sharing just a couple quotes from the scriptures on humility, because I think they touch well on some of the things we're going to talk about today. So the first one is from James, the James's epistle, chapter 4. God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And from Proverbs, chapter 11, when pride comes, then comes dishonor, but with the humble is wisdom. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today comes from an article that was produced from research we're doing here at the Danielson Institute. The lead author was Elizabeth Glenn Ruffing, who is one of our doctoral students, and she worked with a team of people and really put together a beautiful paper that we can make available to anyone who's interested. So let's talk a little bit about narcissism. Here's a definition of pathological narcissism or problematic narcissism. Pathological narcissism is characterized as an impairment in the ability to manage and satisfy needs for validation and admiration. So what's centrally being sought after in a problematic way are validation and admiration. It's not that every human being doesn't need validation and admiration. That's In some ways, those things are part of the air that we breathe and we try to offer one another. The difference here is that those become the sole focus of somebody who's suffering from a more problematic kind of narcissism. All right. And it's sought in nearly all situations and may be sought in maladaptive ways and inappropriate contexts. Now, within the social science literature about narcissism, there are many different labels that go with it, different types of narcissism. I thought it might be interesting for me just to read a few of those so you get a sense of the range. So there's thick versus thin-skinned narcissists. There's oblivious versus hypervigilant narcissists. There are arrogant, entitled narcissists as opposed to depressed, depleted narcissists. There are overt versus covert narcissists. Overt versus shy narcissists. Compensatory, amorous, elitist, and unprincipled narcissists. And craving, paranoid, manipulative narcissists. So each of these is a label that some researcher, clinician has found within their work doing psychotherapy and put some label to. For our purposes, we're going to use a couple more simple labels. The first one is called the grandiose narcissist. And grandiose narcissism involves a repression or a bracketing out of both negative self-perceptions and negative perceptions of the self by others. What that means is somebody who's suffering from a grandiose narcissism almost has a mental block against anything negative people think about that person. And they also have an internal block against their own negative self-evaluations. So the only thing that can get through those filters are things that build them away. They often have an inflated self-image, manipulativeness, domineering behavior, and the pursuit of interpersonal power and control. I tend to prefer using the term narcissism over narcissist, as it kind of separates some of the stigma that would go with labeling someone as a depressive as opposed to having depression, or an anxious person versus having anxiety. So, first category, grandiose. Those are people who block out anything negative about their self-assessment and they pursue power and control. The other category is vulnerable narcissism, and this also involves entitlement and a need for admiration, but is characterized by hypersensitivity, shame, anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, helplessness, and a tendency to idealize others. So the grandiose narcissism is trying to build up a sense of self that's very fragile. The vulnerable narcissist, in a sense, is just trying to get enough admiration and idealization to keep them together. So one tends to look very big, the other tends to look small. So along with this, let's also think about healthy narcissism. First of all, up until about 1900, nobody talked about narcissism clinically. It wasn't a phenomenon that was used in that way. Starting about 1900, I think 1899 actually, it started to be noticed and talked about in the mental health field as people noticed these kinds of patterns. Typically, narcissism was thought of in a negative way. More recently, it's been thought of as this, and this goes back to the 1960s, 1970s with a clinician named Heinz Kohut. Narcissistic needs were seen as developmentally appropriate, that any developing human being requires validation, admiration, attunement to who they are and to their emotional states. And the provision of this kind of good attention builds up a healthy sense of narcissism. So we'll think of healthy narcissism as including capacities for self-esteem, empathy, creativity, wisdom, and a sense of humor about one's personal limitations. And that's opposed to the pathological narcissism, which runs counter to all of those strengths. So realistic self-esteem, empathy, creativity, wisdom, and a sense of humor, a kind of flexibility in looking at one's own shortcomings. All right, to play off the healthy narcissism theme a little bit, I wanted to share what I consider to be the prayer par excellence related to healthy narcissism, or in this case, humility. And it comes from our Lenten tradition, the prayer of Saint Ephrem. I'm going to read the prayer, and then I want to say a little bit about different parts of it. So the version I have here is provided by Father Alex Gusetis, because I always appreciated the way that he used this prayer. Lord and Master of my life, take from me the spirit of laziness, idle curiosity, lust for power, and vain talk. Grant to me, your servant, the spirit of moderation, humility, patience, and love. Yes, Lord and King, grant me to see my own faults and not to judge my brother or sister, for you are holy now and forever. Amen. Now, a social science look at humility breaks it into three primary pieces. Piece number one, humility is defined by accurate self-appraisal. In other words, knowing and having a realistic take on one's strengths and limitations. From a social science perspective, a person has a good sense of their strengths and limitations, and accurate self-appraisal. When we look at the prayer, sorry about that. Clear that off for a second.
You were on humility,
Okay.
and that it's defined by an accurate sense of self-appraisal and recognition of strengths and weaknesses.
Got it. Thank you. So within the prayer, we see, Lord and King, grant me to see my own faults, very much in line with that self-appraisal, and take from me the spirit of vain talk. Don't let me go off on vanity and how good I am. Let me stay within that place of accurate self-appraisal. Number two, humility, a receptive orientation towards others, including an appreciation of human differences. So from a social science perspective, the second aspect of humility is to be open to others. From the prayer, help me not to judge my brother and sister. That would be more of a closed. Carrie, are we still good on the camera?
We're good on, hold on, sorry. Yeah, we're good on your voice, but you're frozen on the screen. And those of you who are watching, please let us know if the voice is coming through okay, and if George is frozen on your screens or not. If you would just type that in the question and answer part. Oh, George, you're back.
All right, good.
All right, we're good. If anybody's having a problem, please let us know.
All right, we back in business?
Yes.
Okay, so an open orientation towards others. Help me to not judge my brothers and sisters. And take from me the spirit of idle curiosity and lust for power. All of those things, one way of understanding them, both psychologically and I think spiritually, is to not close my heart and close my mind in relation to other people. So we have accurate self-appraisal, we have a receptive orientation towards others. The third aspect of humility from a social science perspective is the capacity for self-regulation of emotions, particularly shame and pride. So to have a full emotional life, but to not have it overtake us or take us down roads that become destructive or self-destructive. Again, going back to the prayer, take from me the spirit of laziness, idle curiosity, lust for power, and vain talk. Don't let my emotions sweep me away with a spirit that would be one that closes me down or makes me lose part of myself. And grant to me, your servant, the spirit of moderation, humility, patience, and love. All beautiful, prayerful understandings of a regulated internal world, a world that's connected to God, that has this realistic self-appraisal, that has this orientation towards others. A regulated emotional life seems to have a connection to humility in the spiritual life as well. Okay, so let me just say a couple things about humility and clergy, and then we'll go back and talk about narcissism and clergy families. So empirical research to date suggests that clergy humility has positive implications for clergy mental health, spiritual health, and congregational health. Communities that have humble clergy leadership, where there's accurate self-appraisal, receptive orientation towards others, and a capacity for self-regulation of emotions, those communities are healthier. Humble leaders have also been found to foster learning-oriented teams, engaged employees and congregants, tremendous satisfaction with community life, and retention of congregants. So these are some of the fruits that are associated with humble leadership. And finally, just an interesting aspect of this is a colleague of ours, Peter Jankowski, talks about the religiousness humility paradox, that another aspect of clergy humility seems to be the capacity to both represent a robust faith while at the same time holding a kind of humility about how much that can really mean in terms of knowing God and knowing about God. So a healthy faith, but also humility about one's limitedness and really being able to know and talk about God. That seems to be another aspect of clergy humility that's important. All right. So we're going to turn now towards narcissism in clergy.
George, may I ask a question?
Yes.
In terms of these three characteristics of humility that you've been speaking about, the second one, this receptive orientation to others, I wonder, especially as clergy couples, how sometimes we may struggle with people who are different, whose orientation to orthodoxy or perspective of orthodoxy or road of orthodoxy might look a little bit different from our own. And the interplay of humility with that, and then what that would actually look like in relationship when we do disagree about things.
It may be one of the most important skills, attributes, fruits of humility, is to be able to both hold on to oneself in the midst of difference with others, particularly religious difference, but any kind of difference in community life, while maintaining an open stance towards the other's beliefs, the other's truths, even to the extent that those truths may feel foreign, threatening, off base, unusual, inaccurate. It's one of the most difficult things and one of the most important things to maintain this open stance towards the other and the truth of the other. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the skills that go along with that. I'll just share a quick anecdote. I remember as a seminary student taking the Introduction to Old Testament class, and it was probably our first. It was early on in the seminary curriculum, and our professor was the current Archbishop Demetrius, and he had to put up with a class full of young, eager seminarians who had all kinds of ideas about what different passages meant and about what should be happening in the church, and who were not afraid to voice their opinions in his class. He embodied this kind of humility, this open stance towards others. I never heard him say a cross or critical word about a comment made in his class, no matter how on point or accurate or inaccurate it was. He would find a way to incorporate and value the effort of bringing something in to the class, to that small community. At the same time, wouldn't let one idea trump other ideas that he was trying to get across. So, you could say that it was a technical skill that he had, but it felt much more like a heart skill that he had in accepting what was coming from others while not giving it too much power.
And I think that that's also reflected in our attitude towards people of other faiths, be they Christian or non-Christian faiths, that we hold on to our own and maintain the integrity of what we believe, but also then being able to be with others who have different values and belief systems, and be able to be open to others, and what that really looks like, and how sometimes we want to just isolate ourselves in our Orthodox world and not really be present to those outside.
Mm-hmm. It's true. For the human limbic system, the part of us that is in charge of our inner emotional life, difference on an immediate basis signals potential danger. And so when we come across differences of faith or differences of gender or differences of skin color, it's natural for the limbic system to have an immediate response of not necessarily this is danger, but this could be danger. And it takes a kind of humility, which is a practiced skill and one that we pray for too, because we can't do it all on our own, to slow things down enough to overcome that initial burst of this could be dangerous, to, in a sense, be hospitable to that which is different. It's interesting. Oh, go ahead, Carrie.
Lots of ramifications for parish life, parish council meetings, the way we presbyteros interact with different ministries in the church and people we may not get along with very well, et cetera, et cetera. So right. Lots of ramifications here.
Right. And it's a great question, especially in relation to our larger topic of narcissism, because a kind of grandiose or vulnerable narcissism is characterized by an intolerance for differences, for needing to stay in control of the narrative, to needing to be in control of relationships so that they only fulfill the purpose of building somebody back up from a place of vulnerability to a place of invulnerability. And difference makes us vulnerable. It does. Okay, so let me say a little bit about narcissism and clergy. So a study of United Methodist clergy found that clergy had higher levels of overt narcissism than in the general clinical sample. and that overt narcissism predicted a faster ascent to higher levels of power in the church. So there was a relationship between problematic narcissism and rapid movement up the ladder in the church. Also, there was no relationship, and this was kind of surprising, there was no relationship between problematic narcissism and the number of transfers somebody had undergone to different assignments or the length of time they spent in any one assignment. So I'm not sure what that means. I just thought it was an interesting finding. Okay, let's see. How are we doing on time?
We're good. We're about almost a half an hour into it.
All right. So here are some things about the clergy role that can sometimes act as attractants to people from a more narcissistic, more vulnerably or grandiose narcissistic place. Things about church life or ecclesiastical life or community life that act as like sugar water to to the needs of being validated. So one is idealization, the amount of idealization that can happen towards religious leaders, both clergy and presbyteros. Now, I know there's the flip side of that same coin is devaluation and not seeing any good. But one side of it that can be seen as an attractant is if I become clergy or part of a clergy family, it will elevate me because of the idealization. It will become one of those things that builds me up. Another thing is less accountability than in other roles. In other words, have multiple roles with people in a community to be a liturgist, counselor, supervisor. Oh, sorry about that. All right, did we lose the picture again?
We did. Mari, please take care of it like you did last time, but we can hear you, George, so go ahead.
All right. Let me just fix that up real quick.
Oh, actually, it fixed itself last time, George, so hopefully it will again.
All right.
Or you did something.
I did something last time, but I'm not sure I'm going to be able to pull it off again. Let me just give me 1 second. See if I can.
If you're on the Mac, oh, there you go.
Okay.
You're back, George.
All right. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
That's one of my 4 daughters who doesn't know I'm on a webinar today. Keeps calling in. Okay, so idealization, having multiple roles in the community. My guess is that in any community, there will be a range of interactions that clergy and presbyteros have. There's probably a middle range where things basically go okay. There's a range where people are going to be very solicitous and idealizing, and there's going to be a range of people that are going to be problematic no matter what. To the extent that somebody needs to get their narcissistic needs met, their need to be built up, there's going to be a drifting towards that idealizing group and the roles one can fill with that idealizing group over and over and over again, which can be problematic because it leaves a lot of people on the outs, but it can also be problematic because a lot of people don't get tended to, and it becomes almost like an idealizing echo chamber for the priest and the presbytera.
So in other words, I'm going to use more street language for this. Mm-hmm. The priest and presbytera would tend to be more attracted to their fan club. Nice. And those that tend to prop them up more.
That's right.
rather than those that may challenge and question.
That's right.
Okay.
And if difference signals potential danger, somebody who's narcissistically vulnerable is going to steer clear of anybody who's bringing a difference of opinion, a difference of approach to faith, a difference of, anything that would signal potential danger, and stay close to a fan club that's going to be validating. And a spiritually engaged young person in a narcissistically vulnerable could very well be drawn to ecclesiastical life in some ways because they're validated by virtue of their interest in spiritual life. So they might be held up as being exceptionally spiritual in comparison to their peers, and invited in and have the road smoothed before them into ecclesiastical life, which validates part of who they are, but doesn't necessarily address their vulnerabilities or their limitations. Another thing that can be attractive is the idea of perfectionism and holiness, that for somebody who's got narcissistic vulnerabilities and traits, the idea of being perfect is really important because then they're invulnerable. And so if being a clergy person, or I guess you could imagine in some instances, even being a presbytera, is seen as being viewed with a kind of idealized perfectionism, then it could reinforce somebody who's vulnerable into going towards those roles and only staying in places where they look the right way. First impressions, people with grandiose narcissism especially, are great at first impressions and do a great job in the short run. And it's not until things get more involved and difficult and differences start to bubble up that it becomes problematic. So there's a way in which people with grandiose narcissism get their foot in the door because in ecclesiastical life, they can look really good, especially if they've been working at looking good in the ways that get rewarded within the church. So let me just go through. This is from a study by Williford and Williford. It's 6 signs of narcissism in clergy, kind of things to look out for. 1, all decision-making centers on them. 2, impatience or a lack of ability to listen to others. So it's that closed orientation. Delegating without giving authority. So giving people responsibility, but not giving them authority to carry it out, or putting too many limitations on them. Feelings of entitlement, number 4. Number 5 is feeling threatened or intimidated by talented staff. And the final one is needing to be the best and brightest in the room. So these 6 signs are potential indicators that there are narcissistic issues at work in a ecclesiastical system characterized by narcissistic leadership.
George, real quickly, could you go through those again?
You bet. Number 1, all decision-making centers on the leader. 2, there is impatience or a lack of ability to listen to others. 3, delegating. They tend to delegate without giving proper authority or by imposing too many limits on the people that they give tasks to. In other words, they give them responsibility without authority. Number 4, feelings of entitlement. I should be treated in a certain way simply because I am the leader or the presbytera. Number 5, feeling threatened or intimidated by their talented staff or parishioners. And number 6, needing to be the best and brightest in the room. All right.
And I think sometimes there's a temptation to think that we're listening to others and practicing conciliar decision making, where in fact we're manipulating the situation to get what we believe we know is what's right.
Mm. You
know, sometimes something's happening in the parish, like a building project, and the priest knows exactly what he wants. And I've seen this happen where he can manipulate to make people think that in fact they're part of the decision making, but he's just bringing them along. And I think that same temptation is there when somebody is in a therapeutic relationship with a therapist, because the therapist might think, I know what's right for this person, and I'm just going to sort of manipulate this person to getting them to the place where I think is best for them. Mm-hmm. And especially as priests and clergy wives, when we have some knowledge, hopefully, of the faith. I mean, our clergy certainly do. Many of our wives have chosen to educate themselves or be educated also in the faith. And when we think we have the answers about the right way to practice our faith, what is clearly right and what is clearly wrong in terms of morals, and we see things very, in our own minds, as being very black and white or very clear, narcissism can really creep in through manipulation, but yet thinking that we're not really manipulating.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Carrie. I think narcissism tends to make us vulnerable to seeking shortcuts in relationships that provide us what we need. And as leaders, as ecclesiastical leaders, priests, presbyteros, and their roles within a community, my guess is you all can attest over and over again that there aren't any shortcuts. Especially, I would gather that that's usually true, but especially now in a country that's in the West, that's in a democratic nation, that's in a place where building consensus is so important, where letting people's voices be heard is important, where paying attention to issues of power and whose voices get the most play anyway, and hearing the voices that aren't heard as much needs to be fostered. It doesn't happen automatically. All these things take time and patience and make us confront difference over and over and over again. And the idea that there's a shortcut to that process simply isn't true. And I think some of the deeper wisdom of a conciliar approach to ecclesiastical life, flowing from our Trinitarian theology, is so wise that there's a coexisting truth of unity and diversity going on all the time. And to try and just shrink it down to unity too quickly, or to just leave it as unfettered diversity, those don't work. They have to be working together. Narcissism tends to go for unity, and unity quickly. All right, so here are a few things that that help to draw off some of the difficult aspects of narcissism. They're both relational concepts. One of the things that we're working on here at the Danielson Institute, we call a relational spirituality model. And essentially, it's a model that takes seriously the more relational approaches to psychotherapy, the more relational aspects of religious and spiritual traditions, and takes very seriously the difficulty and necessity of appreciating and working with human differences, and that process of cooling off the limbic system long enough to open up more space for different voices to be heard. So one of the theories that we really rely on is called attachment theory. It's a developmental theory, and the developmental capacity for what we call secure attachment is a key aspect of a mature relational spirituality that helps clergy and clergy family to practice healthy forms of humility and to resist narcissism. Secure attachment typically flows from an early developmental history of empathic attunement. I could go on for another hour about that, but I'm just going to assume you know enough what that means.
Tell us a little bit about what you mean by that.
Okay, so empathic attunement is what early caregivers are able to offer to developing infants, toddlers, and children that signals to them that their caregiver understands well enough their emotions, their thoughts, and their behaviors, and that they'll take the time to understand it when they don't in a non-retaliatory, non-defensive, and non-abandoning way. So basically that that the caregivers can hang in there with their children long enough to really see in them who they are and who they're becoming. Excuse me just one second. So that's empathic attunement. The flip side of that is misattunement, which is when the caregiver is not able to figure out those inner states, thoughts, feelings, behaviors of the child, or malattunement, where the caregiver, in their own dysregulation and frustration at not getting it, become retaliatory or abusive or sadistic towards the child. The first kind, the attunement, creates secure attachment. Secure attachment then begets the capacity to enter the world ready to learn and curious. The misattunement and malattunement result in the child entering the world either preoccupied, holding on to relationships, constantly anxious about whether they're there or not, or avoidant, detaching themselves from relationships and living a life where they've constantly put up a wall between themselves and other people. Now, those are safety mechanisms to be insecurely attached and to be avoidantly attached, but they have profound consequences for development and for later adult relationships. So, studies examining the relationship between narcissism and attachment style have found a positive relationship between vulnerable narcissism, where a person, is constantly seeking to be built back up because they so easily get crushed, and both attachment anxiety and avoidance. So insecure attachment is connected with vulnerable narcissism. A second relational concept, developmental relational concept that helps buffer against narcissism and helps build up humility is called differentiation of self. And it originated in the family systems theory of Murray Bowen. Essentially, it refers to a person's ability to balance independence and connection in relationship. So not privileging independence, not privileging connection, but balancing them. To be a person and to be a person in relationship. That's one. The second is to balance cognitive and emotional functioning. So thinking and feeling are balanced and in sync. Independence and connection are balanced and in sync. And that's differentiation of self. Now, humility and differentiation of self are also theoretically aligned constructs connected with one another. To be able to balance things in that way is a way of doing the three things that we talked about earlier, of having an accurate self-assessment, of being open to others, and of balancing emotional life. All right.
So George, if if I'm a clergy wife and I find myself growing very impatient in a woman's philoptochos meeting on a regular basis. And the emotion rises up, and sometimes I just cannot help myself but to speak my mind, and it does not come across lovingly and mercifully. I'm hearing from what you're saying that this is a sign that there's something inside of me that needs to be attended to. Likewise, a priest, and I've heard of this kind of thing recently, of clergy who very easily lose their cool in parish council meetings when something confrontational comes up. So I think this kind of thing applies both to the priest and to the clergy wife and can happen in different situations. So I find myself seeing this. How do I attend to it?
Mm-hmm. So one way to think about this is that for the clergy wife who gets frustrated and then speaks in a way that's not from her best self in the Philoptochos meeting, or the priest in the parish council meeting who gets frustrated and is not working from his best self. There's a kind of trait narcissism, which is something that's in our architecture. It's part of our developmental history. It's part of who we are, that we have to attend to, that we have to do our personal, spiritual, emotional work on a regular basis to try to contain the ways in which we know we get triggered when we feel insecure, when difference feels dangerous to us, when it's hard to believe that people are on our side or that we're safe or protected in a given situation. Part of that experience comes from who we formed to be by virtue of our childhood experiences and any disruptions, traumas, difficulties that we experienced along the way. And part of a healthy spiritual and psychological life is to find a way to get support for and deal with those things. And I'll have some recommendations about that coming up. Another way to be thinking about it is that it's also about what's called state narcissism. State narcissism is triggered by the state of things one is in. So that Philoptochos meeting or that parish council meeting could very well be a toxic, noxious conglomeration of forces within the system that would dysregulate anybody, and that would be difficult. And it's hard to say how much one bears and how much the other bears, the state and the trait, but we're reckoning with both all the time.
Thank you.
Okay, so here's some recommendations. Formation resources that promote self-awareness, authenticity, secure connections, and relational development can each play a role in cooling narcissism and promoting humility. So self-awareness, authenticity, connections, and relational development is what we're going for. Given what we know about the associations between stress, burnout, depression, and increasing levels of narcissism, the more burned out someone is, the more narcissistic they're going to look. Because the more under siege they are, the more difference is dangerous. Helping religious leaders understand their default manner of coping with stress is essential. That's some of the personal work that each of us has to do, is we have to come to a place where we understand that we have patterns of reaction to stress. And some of them are adaptive, but a lot of them aren't. And finding ways to first identify that. Another thing, since stress is often a factor in conflicts between religious leaders and the systems where they're working, boundary training is really important. A colleague of ours here, Nancy Dever, and another colleague of ours in New York, David Olson, wrote a book called Saying No to Say Yes. There's a whole thing in there about boundary training, which I really would recommend people read.
That is an outstanding book, and I've recommended it to many clergy couples. And I think we actually handed it out to one of our clergy couple training sessions at one point, because it was just, it's so valuable.
Mm-hmm. Another thing is the capacity to deal with human differences is something that's been given a lot of thought over the past couple decades. And so there are trainings in intercultural competence that clergy and clergy spouses can go to and learn a lot from. And it's both a skill-based training, but also a formation-based training where one learns about oneself, but also about actual skills in dealing with differences. So that's intercultural competence. Clergy groups, which I know the Archdiocese has been working to put some of these into place, where authentic peer relationships can help people show more of who they are, both vulnerable and limited self, as well as more fully alive and engaged and authentic self. Clergy peer groups where competition and judgment, as much as possible, are left at the door, and it's really a place to share with one another and build best practices. So clergy groups is another recommendation. Guidance from trusted others, good friends who know us and can hear us, individual faith practices, contemplative prayer, worship, spiritual reading, things like these. These are all good resources. Spiritual direction, psychotherapy, coaching, mentoring. I mean, they're all different kinds of ways to be in relationship with wise elders. Pick one and that feels like a good fit and have that as part of one's life. That's very resonant with our tradition.
Somebody just asked to please repeat the name of the book. If I'm correct, George, it's Saying No to Say Yes.
Correct.
Correct, and the authors?
Dever, D-E-V-O-R, and Olson, O-L-S-E-N.
Thank you.
So these are all things that clergy and clergy spouses who are out there in this difficult environment can identify and be doing. For another time, we can talk about all the things that you, Carrie, have started to do and that can be done at the seminary level, beginning before students even come in, at the selection process and the assessment process and the formation process of beginning to take a look at these themes and the building up of self-awareness, supportive social and faith structures, connection to elders and wisdom. All these things really can start in the seminary, ideally.
George, I think for those of us, and I'm looking at the attendees right now, for those of us who are in it, I think most of the people who are attending right now, middle-aged, or younger and middle-aged clergy wives. I don't know if there are any husbands on with their wives today, but it can be a really scary thing if you begin to see when we begin to see some of these things in ourselves that may need to be attended to. And it's easy to just run away from them and to keep building walls around ourselves and not to want to deal with sort of the dark and the ugly that may be within. as well as not recognize the light that is within always too, by the grace of God and through our baptism. So how do we deal with that fear factor if we see things in ourselves that perhaps that are problematic? We know that they're there. We know that they need to be attended to, but we're just afraid to do anything about it.
Mm-hmm. Great question. I think every one of us has people within inner circles, outer circles of relationship that we may have a sense could hear from us something that we experience as shameful within ourselves. I would say the first step, if one is going on this journey, and the understandable fear, the fear that comes from seeing something in ourselves that feels like a stranger, the beginning of being hospitable to something that feels like a stranger in us, is to try to just have a first conversation with somebody. I'm not even recommending that first conversation be with a professional person. It be with somebody that we have a sense has the ears to hear it from us in a non-judging, in a receptive way, so that we can just hear ourselves say it and get some feedback from others about it, to essentially name the shame. And then who knows how the road opens up from there. But that would be a starting point, is if we're sitting with that fear, try to discern who might have the ears to hear it from us.
Thank you. Please, if you have any questions, type them in now so that we can ask them to George before we finish. George, anything else that it feels like you've opened up a lot of doors here today for future webinars that we'll be asking you to do. But with some really, really good information, and I really appreciate how you tied all of this in with the prayer of Saint Ephrem. That connection just fit beautifully. It was like putting two pieces of a puzzle together, and they fit together perfectly. Thank you.
When I first saw the definition that we were going to use for humility here at the Danielson Institute for our research, I looked at it and I thought, boy, that sounds familiar. And so I texted Father Gusettis and I said, can you send me your prayer of Saint Ephrem? And today, before the webinar, I actually went back and found it back in 2016, the exchange that we had, and pulled it directly from that, because it resonates as a healthy prayer. One of the most practical prayers I've ever come across in our tradition. So healthy.
George, another question came in. Mm-hmm. This is a very good one and a very real one. How can we protect ourselves and be authentic? It's confusing. And I think that place of protection may be from sometimes some of the toxicity that is around us and the darts that come at us as clergy wives and clergy couples. Mm-hmm. If I misinterpreted that, the person who typed that question in, please correct me, but I think that's how I understand that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think ideally, authenticity would be something that was available or opportunities for authenticity was available both in quality and quantity. Having done a pretty big chunk of research on the life of priests and presbyteros in the archdiocese, I've come to appreciate that the quantity of opportunity for authenticity for our priests, presbyteros, and their families are limited. And there's a certain amount of self-protection and caution and boundary setting that is absolutely necessary in order to preserve relational security and the security of your and your family's hearts. So that's a reality. The quantity, the widespread availability of opportunities for authenticity, you simply can't assume that it's there. So that leaves quality. I would say one has to really try to be discerning and start with small inner circles of relationships that you may not have thought of as being the place for you to be authentic. They just feel like good, natural, warm connections that you have with certain friends, certain colleagues, certain cousins, certain family members, siblings. I think what we're finding, though, is that it's life-giving, it's necessary for abundant life to have places where one's fuller self, limitations and gifts, can come out into the light and be received hospitably. And so it might take some work to, again, identify people who have the ears to hear more from us authentically, to put things out there that we can then be in dialogue with. And typically in peer relationships, authenticity begets authenticity. So a place where institutionally this might be more possible is in peer groups, clergy peer groups and presbytera peer groups. I understand that's not a given. It's not going to happen automatically. But if they're well facilitated, which I think what's happening is they are, it becomes possible for those to be a structural, institutional way to offer safe authenticity.
The person who wrote this question, also says we were told, trust no one.
Well, that's not going to work. I understand the sentiment, but we got to try to hold the dialectic of that. Trust no one and trust someone. Discern
who
where
we can
trust. And it may not be in the community. The people that you trust may have nothing to do with, the community of influence of which you are a part. And that's sad. It makes me sad to hear that that's what you've been told. But I'm really championing a balancing of that somehow.
Thank you. All right, George, thank you very much. And just for those of you who are still on, we have another webinar next Thursday with Bishop John Abdullah. And the topic for that one is love thy neighbor, even if he or she is difficult. This is a topic that we've had a lot of requests for, that how do we deal with the difficult people in parish life? And George, I think you've actually touched upon some of this today, and hopefully Bishop John will be able to build upon that next week. Great. So thank you, and you'll be hearing from us again.
You're welcome.
Thanks, George.